Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's Arrow Lecture by Professor Amartya Sen. I'm Deborah Satz, and I'm the director of the Center for Ethics, which is the sponsor of the Arrow Lectures. Before I introduce Amartya Sen, I'd like to say a bit about the Arrow Lectures and about Ken Arrow, the Emeritus Joan Kenney Professor of Economics at Stanford, in whose honor these lectures were endowed by a donor. Ken Arrow is one of the most respected and admired economists alive. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1972 for his contributions to general equilibrium theory. Ken, along with Gerard Debreu, proved the existence of an equilibrium for an entire economy, with all prices affecting the supply and demand of every commodity. Walras had formulated the concept in 1874, but it took 75 years for the existence of such a solution to be proven. But he could have won many other Nobel Prizes if they had repeat performances. He could have won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to social choice theory. His 1951 PhD thesis proved the so-called Arrow impossibility theorem. The thesis showed that under a very reasonable set of assumptions, it's impossible to aggregate individual preferences into social preferences in ways that maintain transitivity. This was a big result, which has been taken to have some powerful implications for democratic theory. He could have won a Nobel Prize for his work on uncertainty and risk, which he applied to the field of health, asking why healthcare is different from other goods. He's also contributed to policy questions. For example, he chaired a National Institute of Medicine committee which advocated global subsidies for anti-malarial treatments for the poor in Africa and Asia. He's been publishing on climate change. In fact, his collected papers today add up to more than 6 volumes. Finally, he's an enormous university citizen and a friend. Despite his vast accomplishments and the fact that he knows a lot about everything, he's humble, generous, and open. If there were a Nobel Prize given in the category of Mensch, Ken would be a strong contender for taking that prize. So it's a pleasure for us to host the Arrow series, and I want to thank Ken Arrow for his many contributions over the years. So thank you, Ken. Let me now introduce our Arrow lecturer for this year. Amartya Sen is the Thomas Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University, and he's an especially fitting choice for the Arrow lecture. He, too, is one of the most highly respected and admired living economists. Like Arrow, he's a polymath who has contributed to a wide range of subjects. Sen has made extremely important contributions in at least 4 areas of economics: social choice theory, welfare economics, economic measurement, and development economics. He's probably best known for his powerful essays on famine that persuasively challenge the common view that the main cause of famines is too little food. Instead, Sen's work pointed to some key variables that also mattered, particularly the institutions of a country like a free press and a political democracy. These institutions play an important causal role in ensuring that people's access to food is protected in times of economic dislocation. Sen is also one of the most powerful voices in economics, perhaps the most powerful voice, for restoring an ethical dimension to economics. He's argued that a narrow economic focus on per capita GDP as a measure of social well-being obscures not only distributional concerns, but also fails to measure the actual freedoms that people in society can achieve. For example, he notes the Costa Rican GDP is 1/12 that of the US, but Costa Ricans live as long as Americans. and because they have effective policies for basic education, medical care, and so on, they live longer on average than citizens of South Africa or Brazil, countries with a much larger GDP. They also live substantially longer than African American males in American cities. Sen has tirelessly criticized the straitjackets of much reasoning about economic policy, in particular, a narrow focus on resources and an assumption of self-interested preferences in economic models. He's especially been attuned to the ways that a focus on resources like income obscures other forms of disadvantage, such as those stemming from gender bias. Sen has shown that at high levels of education, women can achieve a great deal to alleviate deprivation, even in the midst of a low GDP. And he's called attention to the ways that a focus on actual preferences in crafting policy can mask oppression, as when people who have too little adapt their preferences and expectations to their condition. Sen's work has at many points intersected that of Arrow's. His emphasis on including additional information in a social evaluation has helped show that there are ways of resolving some of the impossibilities that Arrow's theorem establishes. For one thing, he's argued that interpersonal comparisons should play a role in social judgments. And he has argued that the basis of such comparisons should be the real freedoms that people can achieve. People can lack the ability for various reasons to translate things into freedoms. And so we need to expand the informational bases we have when we're making social assessments of various ways our world is beyond simply a focus on income and wealth. For his work on famines, on welfare economics, and his contributions to social choice theory, Sen was awarded the 1998 Nobel Prize in Economics. He has many awards and honors, including well over 50 honorary degrees. In fact, I read somewhere that his family nickname is Amartya Commencement Sen. Last year, Time magazine in 2010 included him in their 100 most influential persons in the world. And not to be outdone, the New Statesman listed him in their 2010 edition of the world's 50 most influential people who matter. Sen has contributed to our understanding of human rights, of justice, freedom, and global justice. His books, which include Collective Choice and Social Welfare, on economic inequality, poverty and famines, the standard of living, on ethics and economics, Development as Freedom, Rationality and Freedom, The Argumentative Indian, and The Idea of Justice, have been translated into over 30 languages. Perhaps no economist has been as tireless and eloquent an advocate for the need to expand the range of freedoms for people around the world as Amartya Sen. He's read not only by economists and philosophers, but also government leaders, and he's inspired a generation of policymakers, activists, working on an array of human rights and development organizations, as well as ordinary human beings, to imagine a more humane and better future. I've highlighted a few of his many accomplishments, but there are many more. Please join me in welcoming Amartya Sen, who'll be speaking tonight on the topic of social choice and human rights.
Well, it's a great privilege for me to be, am I audible? To be able to give this Kenneth Arrow lecture. Ken has certainly been a stronger influence on my own work than anyone else I can think of. And indeed, it's so much of a privilege that I enjoy that my life consists of giving from time to time an Arrow lecture at different universities. I think this is my 5th Arrow lecture, but I'm delighted. See, if anyone present wants me to give another Arrow lecture somewhere else, I'd be quite happy to do so. Oh, gosh, thank you very much. So let me begin my talk. There's going to be time for discussion, so I don't want to dilly-dally too long at this time. The year 1950, in which Kenneth Arrow published his pioneering paper on social choice theory, which brought this young graduate student widespread recognition as a world leader of innovative social thought, saw quite a few developments of interest to practical social choice. That's 1950. Communist China received widespread diplomatic recognition. The United Nations dispatched troops to the Korean War. The Republic of India was established with its new democratic constitution, and Senator Joseph McCarthy went on a rampage. Social choice theory is relevant to all these highly practical matters. And so it is also to academic intrigues related to group decisions, well portrayed, for example, in C.P. Snow's popular novel, The Masters, which too was published in the same year, 1950, as Arrow's pioneering essay. Despite the relevance of social choice theory to all these practical matters, it would be rather unusual to think of formal social choice theory as being a very practical subject. The development of formal social choice theory has in fact tended to be confined to highly theoretical analysis to a great measure. That apparent remoteness has its advantage, not least in allowing the development of sophisticated techniques of analysis that need formal reasoning and mathematical methods, which would have been hard to sustain if every analytical departure had to be immediately justified in terms of their instantaneous relevance or popular interest. Also, the conceptual generality of axiomatic methods has allowed applications of similar analytical results in widely different fields. For example, while Arrow's immediate concern was with welfare economics, and in particular with the attempts, especially by Abram Bergson and Paul Samuelson, to reconstruct social welfare functions on what were seen as the ruins of utilitarian welfare economics, Arrow's results were equally relevant to political issues of democracy and participatory governance. As Paul Samuelson rightly noted, Arrow's, I quote, mathematical politics does throw new light on age-old conundrums of democracy, unquote. And there is a close connection between the approach of social choice theory and the devising of various methods of social significance, such as indicators of inequality, poverty, mobility, and living standards. I've commented in a series of publications on the connection between the pure theory of social choice and the variety of practical problems that are faced in applied welfare economics, democratic procedures, normative measurement, and the assessment of justice and injustice. What I want to talk about today in this lecture is not any of these connections, at least not directly, but another intellectual departure of great practical interest, which too received one of its greatest advocacy as it happens in the years over which Kenneth Arrow was doing his graduate studies. I refer to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December 1948. There was a reasoned vision of lasting importance underlying the declaration, which was momentous at that time and which remains important today. Invoking human rights has become a major way of challenging inequities and oppression in the contemporary world. And in this development, led by the wonderful Eleanor Roosevelt, the Universal Declaration of the newly born United Nations played a powerfully constructive role. Is there a connection between social choice theory, pioneered in its modern form by Kenneth Arrow, and the perspective of human rights championed in its modern form by Eleanor Roosevelt? I would argue that there is quite a close connection, and the fact that this relationship is being very little discussed and is not perhaps even immediately obvious and transparent makes it all the more important to explore what the connection may be and how it works. There is, of course, a basic motivational similarity reflecting the spirit of the time, and in particular the sense of anxiety that in many ways characterized the world of late 1940s. If Arrow motivated his work by pointing to the academic skepticism of systematic welfare economics in general and utilitarian economics in particular, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights pointed to the practical understanding that, I quote, "the disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind," unquote. The spirit of pessimism would have been a part of the concerns that fed both the departures, and in this sense one could even, perhaps by stretching a point, argue that there was a general connection with W.H. Auden's book, Age of Anxiety, which got Pulitzer Prize also in 1948, at the same time as the Human Rights Declaration, and which captured the uncertainty and anxiety in people's mind at the end of this very destructive Second World War, and which immediately inspired a symphony of piano and orchestra by Leonard Bernstein, and later to a ballet by Jerome Robbins. I have to say, I've never seen the ballet. I would like to see it, though. But it's not these psychological connections that I want to explore today, important as they may have been. I want to comment, rather, on the analytical affiliation of the general approach of social choice theory and the widespread domain of human rights, of which Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a good articulation. One analytical connection is obvious enough. Social choice theory, the early roots of which could be traced to the works of French mathematicians of the 18th century, particularly the Marquis de Condorcet, materialized in a world in which the need for treating human beings in an equal way was gathering momentum. This would be most sharply reflected in the French Revolution, which erupted even as the early social choice theories were presenting their mathematical theorems that shared the general framework of equal treatment of the participants or the people involved. Arrow is an heir to that egalitarian tradition, which was well reflected by him in modern social choice theory in not discriminating between the attention that should be paid to different individuals. On the other side, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 is in many ways an heir to the French Declaration of, quote-unquote, the rights of man, which was also a part of the intellectual radicalism of the period that saw the fall of Bastille. The United Nations went on to proclaim the Universal Declaration in 1948 that we must stand up in defense of, I quote, the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, unquote, identifying them as, I quote, the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, unquote. So there is certainly a basic connection there related to the recognition of the fundamental importance of all persons, but it would be hardly worth giving a lecture on the subject if the connections between social choice theory and human rights did not extend well beyond that elementary affinity. To understand the depth and reach of that connection, we have to see the challenge that the idea of human rights has to face and the constructive line of thinking that social choice theory aimed to consolidate. Even though Arrow's instant fame related to his quote-unquote impossibility theorem, his basic intention was constructive. And indeed, he did present an analytical structure of great versatility and creative promise. Does the constructive line of thinking underlying social choice theory help us to face the challenges that the notion of human rights as a normative assertion has to address? I'd like to discuss why the answer to the question is yes. The social choice approach has something substantial to offer in placing the idea of human rights on a systematic, non-arbitrary foundation. And that is the subject matter of this lecture. Let me say first a few words on what I take to be the central feature of the social choice approach, seen as an approach. I'm not referring to the collectivity of theorems. They all have different domains. Some of them are relevant. This is not in any way technical mathematical paper. Many of the ideas I'll discuss, however, could be related to mathematical results, but I would be discussing only the very general connections here. It's worth recollecting here that Arrow's trailblazing contribution came as a response to an initiative in welfare economics undertaken by Abraham Bergson and Paul Samuelson, as I mentioned earlier, suggesting that we can think of social decisions as being guided by an aggregate social welfare function that represents the interests of the people involved. Arrow proceeded to link that aggregate function to the values of the individuals in the society. And it is the dysfunctional relation between individual values and social choice that became the definitive formulation of the social choice approach presented in Arrow's first book, Social Choice and Individual Values. Arrow changed the use of the expression social welfare function from the aggregate articulation of social welfare to the relation between individual values and social welfare, thereby giving the entire approach a democratic twist that was entirely in line with the other pioneer, the Marquis de Condorcet, wanted to do in his theories about the future of France after the Revolution. A revolution that was very much in the horizon as Condorcet was getting his mathematical results in 1780s, followed by his extensive writings in his large many-volume book, Esquisse. Unfortunately, Condorcet didn't live to see the post-revolution world. Such were the bloodiness of the revolution that when he killed himself, it was clear that others would have done it for him if he hadn't done that. In pursuing Arrow's lead, applied to fields other than those that Arrow himself has considered, including the present topic of applying it to the idea of human rights, I want to make first two preliminary points. Actually, three preliminary points. In the process of writing, a third occurred to me, but I forgot to change this two to three. First, in focusing on quote-unquote values of the persons involved, we also make room for reasoning that shape and sustain those values. Arrow encouraged the engagement of reasoning by insisting that individual values must not be confused with instinctive quote-unquote tastes. And in this, Arrow was broadly in line with Adam Smith's accommodation of the role of reasoning within the formulation of what he called, quote-unquote, moral sentiments. Second, reasoning in social contexts is much enriched by public discussion and interchange of ideas, concerns, and beliefs. The connection between individual values, public reasoning, and open discussion with others cannot but be central to the art of social choice, broadly understood. an issue that has received illuminating exposition not only from Condorcet, Smith, and Arrow himself, but also from the exponents of the public choice school led by James Buchanan. Indeed, Frank Knight, the great economist who inspired the public choice theorists, commented on that necessary connection with much clarity. I quote Knight, "Values are established or validated or recognized through discussion, which is at once social, intellectual, and creative," unquote. Third, even though the values to be considered in the narrowly defined format of social choice theory is those of the members of a polity for which decisions are being made, there is no bar in a broadly defined social choice approach against introducing and considering other perspectives that may come from outside the polity. There's a contrast here, which I discuss in the book, the original position arrangement of Rawls. John Rawls makes it very difficult to do just that. On the other hand, the social choice theory has a much greater versatility to allow that, though this is not a move that Arrow himself makes, but I think it allows it within the analytical structure. Adam Smith made systematic use of these broader perspectives through his device of what he called the impartial spectator. Smith's strategy in invoking impartial spectators, and it's quite clear that he had several perspectives in mind, just not one, makes room for taking note of perspectives that are not overwhelmed by the biases of one's own group, either connected with interest of that group or connected with the parochial thinking of that group. Given the powerful influence which can be implicit and not always clearly perceived of one's situation and group affiliations, it's necessary to examine the perspective of differently situated spectator from, as Smith put it, far as well as near, to overcome partiality in general. There is no insistence here that the outsiders or imagined individuals from far as well as near must be given the same role in decision-making process as insiders. And Smith's commitment here is to allow neglected perspectives to be aired and heard rather than any kind of a voting mechanism. The debate remains, by the way, quite relevant for the issue that come up in the Supreme Court in this country quite often, namely whether non-American argument could be introduced. I'm not going into it today, but those who are interested in it, I do have a paper coming out in the Oxford Studies in Legal Philosophy called Language, Rights and Law, with my Herbert Hart lecture in the law school in Oxford. And there's an early version of it was published, a shortened version in the New Republic, I think around October last year. Smith's point is not that votes and views elsewhere have to be taken into account just because they exist. They may be there, but entirely uncompelling or irrelevant. But that objectivity, but his claim was that objectivity demands serious scrutiny and taking note of different points of view from elsewhere, reflecting the influence of different empirical experiences as well as different traditions of thinking. A different viewpoint poses a question, and even if in many cases the question may merit dismissal after adequate consideration, that need not always be the case. If we live in a local world of fixed beliefs and specific practices, parochialism may be an unrecognized and unquestioned result, as Adam Smith illustrated with the intellectual support that the ancient Athenians, even Plato and Aristotle, gave to their established practice of infanticide, being unfamiliar, as Smith noted, as they were with societies that functioned well without that alleged necessity. As it happens, actually, there were societies where infanticide would have been banned, including in India, because this would be at the same time as as Buddhist rule of the Maurya, the Ashoka, and they certainly would not be allowed in any kind of practical reasoning on that line. So in that case, you have to look east rather than west. Considering the views of others and the reasoning behind them can be an effective way of determining what objectivity demands. This approach of what can be called quote-unquote open impartiality contrasts with the closed impartiality of John Rawls's device of the original position, which confines the point of view to be aired in the context of the original position exercise strictly to the members of the polity in which an imagined contract is being worked out. And this extends the reach of individual values and reasoning well beyond the parochial lines of a given collectivity. Indeed, if Smith's impartial spectator is combined, and this is a fairly important move I'm trying to make here, with the general approach of social choice theory, we get an intellectual framework for social decision that has remarkable reach, as I've tried to discuss in my book, last book, The Idea of Justice. I turn now to exploring the philosophy behind the idea of human rights. Some people find the very idea of human rights to be quite preposterous and absurd. How can there be rights without there being backed by some kind of law? There could, of course, be legal rights that have been actually legislated, and there may even be some rights that are called human rights laws, which have been actually legislated. But then there are rights in this, even in this no-nonsense view, not because of their motivation as human rights, but because they have actually been legislated and they stand shoulder to shoulder with legal rights in other areas inspired by other motivations. But can that be the whole story? For one thing, prior diagnosis of the importance of some rights, unlegislated human rights, clearly plays an important part in motivating so-called quote-unquote human rights legislation. Indeed, a great many acts of legislation and legal convention, such as the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, unquote, has been inspired by belief in some pre-existing rights of all human beings. When Christabel Pankhurst asserted in a speech in London in 1911, I quote, "We are here to claim our right as women, not only to be free, but to fight for freedom," adding that this is, I quote again, "our right as well as our duty." She, Christabel Pankhurst, communicated a strong normative claim that was not yet legislated into British law. Women did not have the right to vote in Britain in 1911, nor would that right be achieved until 1928, 17 years after Pankhurst's speech, and women would start voting only the following year in 1929. The suffragist agitation of which Christabel Pankhurst was a major leader, and related discussion on women's normative right to vote would materially help in the process of leading to the actual legislation to give women the same voting rights as men in Britain, that Britain already had. Furthermore, we must also examine whether legislation is the only or even the preeminent route through which accepted human rights can be made effective. This and other pertinent questions must take us well beyond the temptation to confine the use of human rights to the limits of what has already been legislated, no matter what they are called. However, the relationship between law and human rights does require a closer examination. I shall distinguish between three different types of connections, in particular that human rights are 1, post-legal, 2, proto-legal, or 3, ideal legal. I would argue that while each of these connections can be contingently important, they fail, individually and jointly, to do justice to the nature and use of human rights. We need to see human rights, I would argue, over a much bigger arena of its legal motivation, actual legislation and judicial enforcement form only one part. More particularly, I would argue that human rights are best seen as normative articulations of social ethics, comparable to, but very different from, utilitarian ethics. Like other ethical tenets, claims of human rights can of course be disputed. But the belief that animates the appeal of human rights is that they will survive open, informed, and reasoned scrutiny. Any universality that these claims have is dependent on the opportunity and success in unobstructed reasoning, an issue I've discussed more fully in my book, The Idea of Justice. These questions, I must note, are not new. Debates on this subject have occurred for more than 200 years. American Declaration of Independence took it to be self-evident that everyone is endowed, I quote, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, unquote. And 13 years later, in 1789, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man asserted that, I quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, unquote. But Jeremy Bentham did not wait long in his anarchical fallacies, written during 1791 and 92, aimed particularly against the French rights of man, to propose the total dismissal of all such claims. Bentham insisted that, I quote, natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, he explained, I don't think in great praise, an American phrase, rhetorical nonsense. Nonsense upon stilts, unquote. I take that to be some kind of an artificially elevated nonsense. That dichotomy remains very alive today. And despite persistent use of the idea of human rights in worldly affairs, there are many who see the idea of human rights as no more than, quote-unquote, bawling upon paper, shouting on paper, to use Old English, to use another of Bentham's mocking portrayal of natural rights claims, such as the French rights of man. Bentham took the appropriate comparison to be that specifically between the legal significance, respectively, of one, Declaration of Human Rights, and two, actually legislated rights. Thus defined, not surprisingly, he found the former to be lacking, obviously enough, in legal status in the way that the latter, that is, a legislated right, clearly had. Bentham's dismissal of human rights came thus with amazing simplicity. I quote from Bentham, right, the substantive right is the child of law. From real laws come real rights. But from imaginary laws, from the law of nature can come only imaginary rights, unquote. However, insofar as human rights are taken to be significant ethical claims, and I believe they are, the pointer to the fact that they do not necessarily have legal or institutional force, at least not yet, is obvious enough, but really altogether irrelevant. The right comparison is surely between, one, a utility-based ethics championed by Bentham himself, which sees fundamental ethical importance in utilities, but none in human rights, and it also doesn't have any legal status, and two, an ethics that makes room for the normative significance of human rights, as advocates of rights of man did, linked with the basic importance of human freedoms and related to that of the corresponding social responsibilities, duties, which I won't discuss very much in the book. I spent quite a bit of time on that, about what Kant called perfect obligations as well as imperfect obligations of various kinds. Just as utilitarian ethical reasoning takes the form of insisting that the utilities of the relevant persons must be taken into account and should be the basis of in deciding what should be done, The human rights approach demands that the importance of freedoms that are incorporated in the form of human rights must be given normative recognition and its implications worked out. Even, in fact, even as Bentham was busy writing down his dismissal of the rights of man in 1791-92, the reach and range of ethical interpretation of rights were being powerfully explored in Thomas Paine's Rights of Man and in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, with strictures on political and moral subjects, unquote. That's the title. Both published during 1791 and 92. Though neither of these works, nor even the earlier book of Mary Wollstonecraft on the Rights of Man, seem to have aroused Bentham's curiosity in the least, as far as I can judge by looking at what he said, what he took an interest in. If human rights are not just post-legal, what about the possibility that they are proto-legal? In fact, however, an ethical understanding of human rights goes not only against seeing them as legal demands, that is, legislated lies, and against taking them to be, as Bentham views, legal pretensions, it also differs from a law-centered approach to human rights, which sees them as if they're basically grounds for law. That is, almost laws in waiting. Ethical and legal rights do, of course, have motivational connections. In a rightly celebrated essay, Are There Any Natural Rights?, Herbert Hart, one of the leading experts on jurisprudence in the 20th century, argued that people, I quote, seek of their moral rights mainly when advocating their incorporation in a legal system, unquote. Whereas Bentham saw rights as a child of law, Hart's view takes the form, in effect, of seeing natural rights as parents of law. They motivate and inspire specific legislation, what I'm calling the proto-legal argument. There's an interesting question, which I won't go into in great detail, but I want to give a brief answer since there will occur to many people here, of territorial variations in the identification of what human rights are in different regions, with the shared global, which could vary from one place to another, with the shared global status of the idea of human rights. The claim of human rights need not take the form that this is ideally legislated into the statute book everywhere, as this is, quote unquote, a natural right, since the appropriateness of legislation may strongly depend on contingent social circumstances. The demand need not have much to do with calls for legislation in some imagined state of nature. For example, if some residents are excluded from being covered by, say, Social Security, or from having a state-sponsored medical insurance that others in similar circumstances already have in the existing institutional structure, the moral and political demand in contention has to be seen in the specific context of the institutional arrangements that exist in that society, from which some are unjustifiably excluded. The issue of discrimination, given the existing national arrangements, also directly involved, for example, in Christabel Pankhurst's demand that women too should have voting rights, since men already had such rights. As John Tassoulas, an Oxford philosopher, has argued in an illuminating essay called The Moral Reality of Human Rights, I quote, human rights enjoy a temporally constrained form of universality, so that the question of which human rights exist can only be answered within some specific historical context, unquote. There can, in fact, be little doubt that the idea of human rights can serve, and has often served in practice, as the basis of new legislation. That is precisely the way the diagnosis of inalienable rights was invoked in the American Declaration of Independence and reflected in the subsequent US legislation, including the amendments a route that has been well trodden in the legislative history of many countries in the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, can in fact be seen as a strong invitation to recognize the importance of these freedoms and to make them actually effective when necessary through new legislation. Providing inspiration for legislation is certainly one way in which the ethical force of human rights has been constructively deployed. However, to acknowledge that such a connection exists is not the same thing as taking the relevance of human rights to lie exclusively in their playing an inspirational or justificatory role for actual legislation. It's important to see that the idea of human rights can be and is actually used in several other ways as well. It's easy to appreciate that human rights, if human rights are seen as powerful moral claims, indeed as quote-unquote moral rights, to use Herbert Hart's phrase, then surely we have reason for some catholicity in considering different avenues for promoting these quote-unquote moral rights. The ways and means of advancing ethics of human rights need not thus be confined only to making new laws. For example, social monitoring and other activist support provided by such organizations as the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, Save the Children, Red Cross, or Action Aid, to consider many different types of NGOs, can themselves help to advance the effective reach of acknowledged human rights. In many contexts, legislation may not in fact be at all involved. Public exposure and condemnation can have a huge role in preventing violations of what are widely acknowledged to be moral rights of others. I've argued so far against seeing human rights only as consequences of appropriate legislation and only as motivation for making such legislation. But what about the view, which has sometimes been aired, that human rights are best seen as ideals for legislation? This raises an interesting question about the appropriate reach of the legislative route. Would it be reasonable to claim that if human rights is seen as important, then it must be ideal to legislate it into a precisely specified legal right? If we can't do it, it's because we can't get to the ideal. Is that right? I will definitely resist this proposal. For some rights, the ideal route may not be legislation, but something else, such as recognition or agitation or public discussion or even education, with the hope to change the behavior of those who contribute to the violation of human rights. For example, recognizing and defending a wife's moral right to be consulted in family decisions, even in traditionally sexist societies, the wife's right to be consulted may well be extremely important. Indeed, I've discussed how important it is in my book, Development as Freedom. It's very central. And yet, it seems entirely plausible that coercive legislation, to which Hart refers, with the imprisoning or fining of husbands who ignore the views of their wives, may be much too blunt a way of dealing with making sure the husbands consult their wives in family decisions. I would be sometimes quite happy to see their husbands disappear in handcuffs in the jail, but that is a frivolity in my mind, I think. Because of the importance of communication, advocacy, exposure, and informed public discussion, human rights can have influence without necessarily depending on coercive legal rules. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft, who explored many different types of social change through what she called vindication of the rights of women, was concerned with a variety of means, including media, public discussion, and legislation too, but among many other things. That 18th century insight remains relevant today. The time has now come for me to return to social choice theory. What lies behind the normative basis of human rights? How should we judge whether and why to take them seriously? Any general plausibility that these ethical claims or their denials have is on this theory dependent on their survival and flourishing when they encounter unobstructed discussion and scrutiny, along with, of course, adequately wide informational availability. The connection between public reasoning and the formulation and use of human rights is extremely important to understand. The soundness of the normativity of a claim for human rights would be seriously undermined if it were possible to show that they are unlikely to survive open public scrutiny. However, the case for human rights cannot be discarded simply by pointing to the fact that in politically and socially repressive regimes which do not allow open public discussion, many of these human rights are not taken seriously at all. Open critical scrutiny, actual or imagined, is as essential for the dismissal of a normative claim as it is for the defense of that claim. This is in fact a broad social choice approach, with the Smithian addition of allowing the point of view of others to be aired in the form of impartial spectators. We are insisting on relating the assessment of human rights to the values sustained by adequate discussion, including imagined encounters in reasoning of the people themselves, which is, of course, the central philosophy underlying social choice theory as I understand it. So what are the steps involved? First, we take the basic social choice approach, which I've already discussed. Second, the focus is on people's values, not just their taste, a distinction that Arrow discussed in his 1951 book. Third, there is room for reasoning in general, and public reasoning in particular, in this way of looking at the idea of human rights, in line with Frank Knight's diagnosis of values as being, I quote, at once social, intellectual, and creative, unquote. And finally, taking the constructive suggestion of Adam Smith, human rights discourse allows consideration of points of view of people from outside the society on grounds of the relevance of the perspective of impartial spectators. Thus interpreted, social choice theory is not just a theory of voting, and the impartial spectators may have articulation rather than votes. But the basic commitment in seeing human rights this way is to rely on public reasoning about people, including outside points of view considered for their relevance and cogency. One advantage of allowing impartial spectators is to admit into the discussion what, on the basis of our best reasoning, we think what future generations may have to offer to our discussion today. In the broader framework of social choice theory outlined here, and more fully discussed in my book, In the Idea of Justice, that would be a natural extension of the social choice approach, even considering problems of sustainability and of the environment. What would these people say? What would be the point of view they would like to draw our attention to? There is a serious need for extension here, and if the steps mentioned here are taken, that extension will be entirely reasonable and non-arbitrary. But note that we are moving away from seeing social choice theory as basically theory of voting. In fact, the importance of voting strength on its own may be far less than an adequately broad public discussion with all the relevant points of view. And this applies even when no outside views are admitted through the device of the Smithian impartial spectator. Take a case when it's not done, that's not done. Same thing applies. Consider the widely observed fact that no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent country with a functioning democracy, including a relatively free press. Large famines have occurred in authoritarian colonial regimes, as in British India or in repressed Ireland, in fierce military regimes, as in Ethiopia or Sudan in recent decades, in one-party states, as in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, in China during 58-61, in Cambodia in the 1970s, or in North Korea in very recent years. But how does famine prevention work in a democracy? The proportion of the national population that is affected by a famine rarely exceeds 10%. Indeed, I know of none. And typically, it's less than 5%. This must look electorally insignificant. And on its own, it certainly is so. And yet, public discussion of the nature of the calamity can make the fate of victims a powerful political issue, with far-reaching effects on the climate of media coverage and public discussion, and ultimately on the voting of others, a potential majority. Indeed, the potential famine victims have far greater protection from reasoned public discussion than they would if they had, for example, 2, 3, or even 4 votes per person. It may well be a general mistake to identify the force of social choice theory too closely with voting mechanisms. That too, there's a lot of interesting theorems on that. I don't disown them. They're all part of the discipline. But not just that. And the focus on public reasoning with the broadenings I've discussed gives the social choice approach a much larger reach and relevance. Is this a completely eccentric view of rights in general and human rights in particular? I can see people saying, there Sen goes again, arguing something utterly implausible to an unconvinced public. I believe it's not that eccentric, and in fact been used before. I never claim originality for any of my work, so whenever people point out others have said that, I cheer up, because that's what I want to show, that I'm in the mainstream of thinking, even though others say that I'm not. Let me give 2 very different illustrations of past reasoning about rights that have gone on somewhat parallel lines. The first illustration comes from Hugo Grotius, who may take to we may take to be the founder of the discipline of international law. And when I gave the Grotius lecture to the American Association of International Law earlier, a few months earlier, I was impressed by the connection, which actually I hadn't read that much Grotius before. But giving a Grotius, I mean, Kenneth Arrow, I have a certain advantage. I've read him fairly extensively, but Grotius was new territory for me. But I was very impressed. I refer in particular to Grotius's argument when he is discussing the freedom of the sea. In his book, The Free Sea, published in 1609, Grotius makes a powerful appeal to the common understanding of reasonableness and presents a general view of political normativity that is not parasitic on legislated law by one nation or another, for obvious reasons. There is no international law legislated. Grotius is not, of course, discussing human rights. That's not my claim. But he makes plentiful use of the understanding that certain basic entitlements that people have come not from specific national legislations, but from the recognition that these freedoms, to which people in general could be taken to be entitled, come from general appreciation of reason normativity, rather than from any specific territorial legislation. The second example comes not from a stalwart of nation state, as Grotius was. After all, Grotius was defending what Netherlands did to, I think it's called Maria Cristina, a Portuguese boat, and why Grotius thought that you can deal with it as you like. If you have been aggrieved, you can take revenge on it. That was the argument. Unfortunately, the first time I read an argument of this kind, it was in Portugal, so it wasn't very popular, I think, in that context. But the Grotius' reasoning, it came certainly from a fairly conservative national perspective. I quote now a second example, I could quote many others, of a real political and social rebel, in particular Mary Wollstonecraft, arguably, I believe, the most neglected political philosopher of all time. Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her second book, published in 1792, in that she presents much angry rhetoric, some of it very angry indeed. But ultimately, the book appeals to the reasoned agreement among people on what all human beings, she would perhaps even tend to say even women, deserve. The book, which takes the form of a long letter to Monsieur Talleyrand-Périgot, concludes by reaffirming Mary Wollstonecraft's strong confidence in relying on reason with open participation. I quote from Wollstonecraft, "I wish, sir," this is how the book ends, "to set some investigation of this kind afloat in France, and should they lead to a confirmation of my principles, when your French constitution is revised, the rights of men may be respected, if it be fully proved that reason calls for this respect, and loudly demands justice for one half of the human race," unquote. This is in fact a broad social choice reasoning, and I would argue that it is that broad reasoning that makes the social choice approach, with additional features, including Smith, a good basis for discussing the idea of human rights and its contingent reach in the world in which we live. There is, I believe, a strong connection here that demands more attention than it has received so far. Thank you. Do I go?
So we have time for questions, and I'm going to come up and sit here, not to have a conversation, but to field the questions. So if you have a question, if you raise your hand. Over here.
You know, this tie is a very good instrument to put microphone in. When I first came from India to England, I didn't know what the utility of that piece of apparel was, until it became clear to me much later that that's where the microphone is fixed. And from 17th century onwards, as English fashion was evolving, they had no clue why it was evolving until the microphone was discovered. So I'm now reliant on that.
So, yes. Question. I think maybe you should go to the microphone.
In the beginning, when you were discussing the counterposition of Bentham's utilitarian approach with the absolute, if you wish, approach of human rights, or what is usually viewed as counterposition of these two approaches, it made me wonder whether in linking human rights with social choice, are you locating the human rights closer to the underlying individual choices or closer to the axioms? The reason I ask is because what is, as you know, particularly strong about and unique about social choice theory is to put these two things together, while human rights tend to be neatly focused on the individual. So where is the link? Because if the link is on the axioms, it's completely different than if it is on the building blocks. You could have Bentham providing the building blocks and yet have strong axioms doing the absolute reflection that we usually identified with human rights.
Yeah, I got the question, I think. I think I'm very pleased. This is from Professor Graciela Cicilniski, one of the great social choice theorists, from his results I've learned a lot, and quite a lot of the structure that would prove to be relevant even in my approach have topological structures of the kind that Graciela has investigated, rather than the rather simple utilitarian aggregation that we see. I think there's three things I will say, Graciela, in response to what you're saying. One, I'm not making the point that a social choice approach is better served. I did not make the point here that better served by freedom-based, right-based reasoning than by utility. All I said in the present paper was that when Bentham should have compared his utilitarian approach versus the human rights freedom-based approach, if he were to do that, he would be comparing like with like. Instead, he took the legal significance of human rights and compared that with the legal significance of legislated rights. And therefore, he has an easy victory. So he didn't even engage in the issue, nor did I. I'm just pointing out the domain of discussion of Bentham was unduly limited. Second, it's not my claim that you couldn't get a social choice theory that's utilitarian. I know Ken Arrow is much more sympathetic to the utilitarian approach than I am. He may deny it, but he is actually very, I think he's a crypto-utilitarian, really. But we periodically argue on that. We've done so for 30, 40 years now. But there are arguments against the utilitarian position, which I haven't discussed, but I do discuss them in the book. So that, again, I've not come to bury utilitarianism. My main point, again, was the first thing, to say human rights have no legal status is neither here nor there, because nor has utility any legal status. That's not the right question to ask at all. So these are my complaints. My third point would be that, and this is something where it can deny that he's the authority on that. I don't assume he's the authority on social choice, because once you release the subject, then it belongs to all of us, and we can do with it what we like. John also once told me when I said that I'm very hesitant to interpret the original position this way, which I used to work on earlier on, long time ago. In fact, even when I visited here in '79, I gave my first talk on capability in the Tanner lecture here. And I said, look, I've taken a different view of our original position. And he said, you know, once I've formulated, it doesn't belong to me. You can interpret it as you like, what you think makes sense. But I think when Ken makes a distinction between not taste but values, basically with it goes not just interest. And he discusses that, including all-important socializing values. He's making a bigger jump than he wants in the text. Because values, that Frank Knight rightly says, is dependent on reasoning, in a way that Adam Smith also says, moral sentiments, and that's a big thing, is post-reason, of reason co-working with reason in a way that sentiment in another sense is not, which is just, to which David Hume had much greater sympathy than Smith had. Not entire sympathy, but somewhat greater sympathy. So I think in that, Arrow makes, I think, the very first move in social choice theory, already in 1951 in the book, about my moving to values. And once you introduce the values, then it's not our judging. You see, what was the utilitarian exercise? What was Abraham Bergson's and Samuelson's exercise? Social welfare function. It draws on the interests of the people. And therefore, the Pareto optimality, or necessity of Pareto optimality, becomes an instant. There's nothing to argue about there. When I later wrote a theorem saying that there is something about here, I was being more Arrowian than Samuelsonian, because of the fact that Arrow had allowed us to talk about values in the sense of what you altogether, taking everything onto account, want to do, even if it goes against Pareto optimality interpreted in terms of interest, not obviously unanimity in terms of value. That's not Pareto optimality as classically understood by Edgeworth, for example, and Marshall. So given all that, I think there is, in my claim, that the distinction and a defense of a non-utilitarian perspective is more present in Arrow's book than, in fact, Arrow warns us. And so there we are. I've said it all.
Yeah.
Namaste, sir.
Oscar.
Humble apologies for my question will be a little tangential to the topic, but it's important in the area I want to work in. So,
As long as it's not about Osama bin Laden.
no, it's not, sir. Not at all. It's about human rights. It's essentially about human rights. Notwithstanding the efficacy of a coercive population law, do you ever think the political parties and the political scenery in India will ever allow a coercive population law to be passed by the parliament? Something on the lines of China.
Coercive?
Population control law.
Well, I hope not. I'm certainly going to vote against it. You are interested in the question not because a way out law might become a law, way out possibly become a law, or you want it?
Because
You're sympathetic to it.
from what I've read, the biggest problem.
I think you should read more.
No.
Yeah. It's not only, I'm opposed to it not only because I'm in coercion, especially in a very private sphere of life, but also the whole idea, including what I read in New York Times yesterday, the idea that one-child policy contributed to the population slowdown of population growth in China, I think it's based on very bad statistical reasoning, and I say statistical reasoning, because the fact that when we made comparison of all the states, all the districts in India, like 400 of them, mainly Jean Douais, my collaborator, did most of the work, and Mamata Murthy. One thing what emerged is that there are only two factors which make a difference to fertility rate. That's women's education and women's gainful employment. Each of them gives young people a voice. And given the voice of young people, young women, you expect to get less number of people. Now, armed with that, with these two variables, if you plot China, and if you look at both time series, as well as cross-section, you would see China fall bang on the line. So any bump is not getting from the one-child policy. That doesn't mean that it's not tyrannizing. It is tyrannizing, but not achieving very much. So I would suggest that the answer is that there is a danger that such a coercive law would be passed, but as I would say, over my dead body.
Thank you.
Joe.
He's next. Green shirt and then orange shirt.
There's a kind of spatial justice, which my experience of meetings says that chairs always favor. One question, one go like that.
Thank you for the talk. I haven't read the book, so this question might be based on a misunderstanding, but let's imagine a world where no one holds the value that women should have even a basic education, and not only in a particular society, but also in any other society in this world. Can we still say that women nevertheless have a right to a basic education? And if so, in this world where no one holds that value, how can social choice theory help us reach that conclusion?
Well, you have imagined a world in which it would be hard to go in that direction. You imagine the world not only that there's no such right, but everybody, after a great deal of reasoning, agrees on that. But I don't think the world in which we live is like that. So I think, could there be such a world? Yes, I think there could be. Has it any kind of relevance to the kind of societies we know? I would say not. These are contentious issues, and these are discussed, widely discussed. People who want women to behave differently are often put in prison, sometimes caned, which indicates that there is not that agreement on that subject. And the claim here, the Smithian claim here would be that if there's opposition to it, it's like infanticide in ancient Greece, that this question has not been sufficiently engaged. That's the hope. And so I would argue that this is a situation that you've imagined in which your dilemma might well exist. But I would very much doubt that that would be a dilemma that would be in fact faced. And I'm not just saying that therefore there isn't any reason for considering the dilemma. I do believe that sometimes theoretical cases are worth considering. And there I must say, when I read Samuel Freeman's review of my book in the New York Review, where he thought that I was against hypothetical cases being considered, I wasn't certain where Sam was coming from, since I couldn't do much social choice theory unless I was ready to consider hypothetical cases. So I'm ready to consider it, but as a very hypothetical case, what would we do then? But you know, there's work to be done before we go through the really interesting, difficult issues like that one.
Okay, I promised the person there, and then I'll be less spatially challenged.
Looking forward to an internet which has truly democratic word processors, where large groups of people can edit documents, brought about through information theory cracking the challenge of Condorcet's dilemma in the face of Arrow's impossibility theorem, which is to say there is progress, as Arrow hints at the end of his lecture, that challenge should be taken with stride. That process is about to unfold, amongst other things, due to some of the understandings you have brought. And as that happens, democratic word processors and blogospheric best idea percolators will allow us to, as a society, distill the best thinking the society has to offer. How does that vision relate to the issue of human rights?
Well, let me say three things here. First, public discussion and the change of views that may occur as a result of public discussion does not in any way undermine the impossibility theorem at all. I did give my presidential address to American Economic Association on that subject. Ken, I think, chaired that meeting, Ken Arrow did, and Jim Buchanan was present in the audience. I said that when Jim Buchanan said that dissolved the impossibility theorem, that's not based on a complete understanding of how the analytical result proceeds. On the other hand, is it important to consider for social choice theory what he was bringing to the table?
Well,
namely that public discussion can be very important within the structure of social choice theory. And the answer is yes, and that has been recognized even as early as Condorcet's discussion in Esquisse. There's a lot of discussion on that. So I think we have to dissociate it from the impossibility theorem to the importance of public discussion. And your question, how does it relate to human rights? That's what I thought the talk was about. Namely, that if it has to be sustained and claim to some objectivity, and by the way, that is a subject on which I don't, on that issue, don't disagree with John Rawls, because he's in fact defined objectivity in a political sphere as being something which public reasoning could be sustained in public reasoning, and Josh Cohen here had done a great deal of discussion on that. And in that context, the human rights, if they belong, and I think they do, belong in that territory. I think my disagreement with Rawls is that he doesn't want to extend beyond the borders. Reflective equilibrium, yes. Original position, no. And it's that context in which I have disagreement. So I really don't think that we need disagree very much on that. I mean, I think I've indicated how human rights will fit into that framework of public reasoning, internet or no internet. And sometimes these public reasoning are not very well informed. I don't have a Facebook thing, but when I went to Italy last summer, and in the same place we've been there 18 times before, Circe, where Mr. Ulysses was confined in the Odysseus for a while, with somewhat less freedom than I had. When I was checking into the hotel, the man called Luca, who was a booking clerk, said he had been following my website, my Facebook. And I said, look, I don't have a Facebook. And he said, oh, no, yes, you do. I said, yes. I said, yes, indeed. And I've been following how views are changing. They've moved very much more to the right than I recollect your views earlier. Now, that interested me. So then he came after I've checked in and I was settling in with a glass of Prosecco when he came and opened his computer. And there I was, a picture of me with the data about my date of birth, my degrees, and a short curriculum vitae, and me very affably and amiably answering questions in first person. Saying such things that Ludwig von Mises was perhaps the greatest economist I know, that Keynes was really quite mistaken, which I think in many ways he was, but not for the reason that I think he was mistaken. And so then, and I appealed to Facebook, and I got nothing, absolutely nothing from them. And my secretary went on haranguing them, nothing. And then, of course, I used media again, but a different kind. So I called the Hindustan Times. And I said, do you want a story about Facebook abuse? And, of course, I was on the front page in Hindustan Times in all the Indian leading dailies the day after that. And then, I thought, strategically advised by my secretary, to put in the word saying that I'm consulting lawyers to, that was a lie, to how to sue. I mean, there's no way of suing them, how to sue them. Then came a tremendous lot of appeal. This chap who, he would never sign his name. He said, I am a very young admirer of Professor Sen, told my secretary. And I've been saying this in order to promote his ideas. Some of these ideas depart from it, but in a rather Smithian move, he said that I knew that if he considered my argument seriously, this is the position that he would come to accept. So then my secretary said back saying, look, and he said, please tell him not to sue me. Then my secretary, after about 3 of those mailed, and he said, at least you should reveal your name. And then my secretary said, he's actually doesn't really sue anyone much. I think in the company of Ken Arrow, I think once I threatened to sue my publisher, Collective Trust and Social Welfare, because we were not getting royalties. You remember that? Your book and mine, we jointly hired Palmer and Dodge to do that, I think. So, but since then I haven't sued anyone, and even that was necessary. The threat of suing was sufficient. But the moment that came, this chap dropped out. But the Facebook hasn't appeared. There are 2 other Facebook which make clear saying this is not run by me. And there's no saying, thank you very much for writing to me, yours, Amartya. None of that in what we have.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your great theory on social choice. And my question has 2 parts in it. My first question, the first part of this question is like, so let's say if you let people make choices to choose their own groups, in case of lack of resources, the conflict will be there. So how will you avoid this conflict? And we have seen this conflict. So let's say last 4,000 years, we have said countries can coexist on this planet Earth, but they never coexisted. They all are fighting either for oil or for some other resources. And this conflict will remain continue, whether you let them make choices for their language, religion, country, or some other things. And my second part to this question is this loyalty.
That already were 2 questions there. There were the question of what to do in the lack of resources when you have certain objectives and ideas and ambitions. And the second is that people keep fighting for resources. But then there's a third question.
If you would like to take it. It's a very quick question. How do you see, so I mean the same example where people are so loyal towards their groups that even human rights activists call themselves American. So I mean.
Call themselves what?
They call themselves American or, British or whatever. So my assumption.
The American human rights activists call themselves American, which would be quite natural.
Okay.
But you're not saying Libyan human rights activists call themselves American. They don't.
I am confused because my understanding is human rights are constant across the planet. So how can someone say he's American, again go and fight in another country and come back and say I'm again human rights activist?
Well, but I don't think non-American human rights activists are saying that. American human rights activists are saying that because they are American, by definition. So I don't know what the dilemma here is. Coming backwards, countries fighting with each other. I think you exaggerate why people fight each other, not for resources only. I don't even think the Iraq intervention was primarily because of oil. It had something to do with nor was the Vietnam interpretation with the resources. They're concerned with many other ideas. Many of them were mistaken. The Iraq case and the Vietnam case, I believe, were both mistaken. But they were not fights for resources, I think. Actually, I'm sympathetic to those who took the view of the Iraq war that at least if they were going in for oil, they would understand some reasoning for going into Iraq. But there wasn't any such reasoning at all we can think of that would have justified it. So there I'm afraid we are in a kind of disagreement on that. On the first, if you have ambitions which you can't have resources to fulfill, well, that's what the theory of justice is about, namely what we can do to help people in a just way, fulfill to the extent possible, without great inequality, and with some efficiency and achievement, what they try to achieve. And that's what the subject of theory of justice is, and that's the subject of public economics is, and that's what we try to do. So we are engaged in that. That's the subject matter. It's not a dilemma. All right? Okay, thank you.
So I had a question relating to countries like UAE or Qatar, which have free presses in general, but still have, lots of human rights violations that go on, and I've seen them. I grew up in Qatar. I just would like you to comment on certain cases like this.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of human rights violation in this country, and a lot of human rights violation in India. The fact that there is a free press and a democratic system of government doesn't prevent it. It makes it less likely to have certain kind of violation of human rights? Yes, I believe so. We are not dealing with that it will not exist at all the moment you have public discussion. Has the kind of public dialogue that has been sponsored, even by Qatar, for example, in Al Jazeera, has it helped to reduce human rights violations? I believe it has. That's what the debate is about, I think. So I don't think, if you took, and I'm glad you asked the question, if you took the view that it's my theory, that if you have public discussion, then you can't have human rights violation, that is not my theory. Does it help? Yes, it helps a lot. Would I like to see Indian public discussion to be more aimed at some of the violations, not the human rights of the libertarian kind, but human rights like for the protection from undernourishment, not famine, but undernourishment, lack of medical coverage. Yes, I would like the debate to extend there. Would I like China to have more debates about liberty? Yes, I would. But that doesn't mean that I would think that the moment you introduce them, these violations are going to go away. All right? Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Professor Sen.